That's a very good point, and there is a difference, isn't there, between campaigning and promising and governing. Barack Obama found that out very quickly indeed, and it looks like Donald Trump is as well. Frank, Mary came up with a good point about the polls that I touched on at the top. 40% approval rating, but if you look at Republicans, 82% really like what this man is doing, and he's doing it in a very different way. How's this playing out in Harrisburg, not in the Beltway?
Well, I wouldn't know about Harrisburg, but I know there's no falling off of support for Trump amongst his supporters. And indeed there was with respect to Hillary Clinton. There's a bit of buyer's remorse there, unsurprisingly. But I quite agree with Mary. It's really economic. And what's going to happen is we will see in a year's time or 2 years' time where the economy is, and that's what it's all about. I also agree with you that what's crucial here is changing the tone of government by passing legislation. It's going to require legislative acts, and the big things on the agenda are tax, but also immigration reform, the 1965 Act. Jeff Sessions very much wants to repeal that and wants to adopt something like the Canadian system. The tax code is one which might profitably follow from the Canadian example once again. 15%.
By the way, it's worth pointing out that Frank is half Canadian.
That's correct, yeah. Well, no, I'm 100% American, but born in Canada.
There we go.
Right, so this is a legislative agenda, and it's got to get done, and that's really, really important. The economic recovery is part of that, but we're also waiting for some of those big decisions, and we're also waiting for the government to be staffed, because right now, very few people have been hired.
I think that's an excellent point. Can I bring Lenny into this? Because we have a lot of senior positions, as you said, at State Department, but across that haven't been filled. But also the staff that are in there, it seems, if you read the newspapers and not just the establishment ones, seem to be at war with themselves. Steve Bannon against the Trump daughter and son-in-law, you know, the Goldman Sachs group versus the economic nationalists. Lenny, is this part of the fact that we haven't seen a more successful 100 days?
Well, look, I think there's always infighting in White Houses. You go back to the Ronald Reagan years, you had sort of the Jim Baker group versus sort of some of the conservatives like Ed Meese. You go back and look throughout history, and people stake out their territory, so that's not unusual.
This early?
Well, it's just more open right now because everyone seems to be using the press to be able to advance their positioning and their perspective. But I want to go back to one other point, which is that yes, a lot of his hardcore supporters, Republicans, are sticking with him, but not all of his voters are sticking with him, and that's the important distinction. He's keeping maybe that 40% that is solid with him, but there are a lot of voters who were uncertain, who may have voted for Hillary Clinton, but ultimately decided that they want to change. They're the ones where the support is beginning to erode. And I think to some extent, the reason, you know, it's a twofold reason. One is that, you know, his policies really have aggravated not only liberals, but a lot of moderates. And what you've seen is one of the ironic successes of his first 100 days is that you have one of the most aggressive, inspired, motivate opposition movements going on in this country that may ultimately have an impact in the election in 2018 if the Democrats can take over the House. And here's the second thing that he's done that some might call a success. I personally don't. His attacks on the press. I am very, very troubled in a country in which the First Amendment is a pillar of our democracy. It's sacred to what we have for the President of the United States going against good reporting and calling it fake news because that's what he thinks will advance his support among his core voters. And that's troubling to me. So I think he might think it's a success because it inspires people, he shows he's defiant, but for the rest of us, it's very troubling.
Well, it may be troubling in the headline sense, Mary. Do you want to pick that up? Because you know, a lot of people have started watching news again and buying newspapers. The so-called failing New York Times has hundreds of thousands more subscriptions because of it. We certainly have had a huge amount of attention here in Washington on what's going on in our bureau. So do you think this sort of upping of temperature in Washington is helped Trump over the last 100 days? Or do you see that he might recalibrate going forward?
Well, he is a 70-year-old man. He's not going to change his style. I don't see him putting away the tweets. He's learning some.
He's tweeting less.
Yeah, yes, and he came out with a statement on Holocaust, after he had been criticized before for not speaking up enough. But he is the person he is, and you know, some of your guests were talking about tax reform, and you still have the majority of the American people saying, I want to see his taxes to see how well the new proposals will affect him. You see him taking many trips to Mar-a-Lago, and you see him conducting business there. Of course, his companies are benefiting, and his children's companies are benefiting. So there's some criticism there. So in some ways, he really is going to be defiant, and we'll see if his supporters stick with him through all of it, if they don't have results that they can sense in their pocketbooks and in the infrastructure in their communities. So he will change in a sense, but at a certain point, he is Donald Trump, and he figures that's what brought him there. That's why you're going to see him at a rally with his supporters. And we'll see how long that support lasts. And as the other guests have said, he's energized the opposition, and he hasn't really convinced those who had some qualms about him in the first place.
Well, Mar-a-Lago is closing for the season on May 1st, so we'll see less of that. But the chocolate cake apparently is very nice. Frank, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I did actually. I wrote speeches for the candidate, and I learned very early on one thing I didn't want to do was to tell him how to get votes. He knew how to do that quite well, actually. He didn't need any advice. And I think, well, you know, one does make a point about the way he's energized some of the opposition. That cuts both ways. I mean, all those people wearing those obscene hats at women's rallies, I think, have won far more votes for Donald Trump than for anyone else. The great problem has been the holdup in Congress. Trump's popularity is not stellar. The popularity of Congress is in the tank. It just cratered.
In fact, there was a poll out there where Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, is probably the second most powerful person.
And one of the most hated or disliked.
Is the bottom of the heap.
Absolutely right. Yeah. But, you know, we'll wait to see where the economy is. I think the tax reform package is crucial. I think immigration is important as well. He's also added a new tone, which connects to both foreign policy, but also domestic, mostly foreign. And the message is...
Can I just ask you a question on this? You know, America first, and then, you know, 59 Tomahawk missiles over, obviously, a gas attack, which is horrible, but not what was expected of him. This mother of all bombs, which was dropped by a general. Can I tell you about his
conversation with President Xi over this?
We'll go into that a bit later. But what I'm saying is this seems to be a little bit of a departure from what he promised his supporters. And I think everyone's mentioned this in different ways in the first 100 days, is that it's not what you see is what you get. He does, you know, it's not what it says on the tin.
No.
You know, and that might be a little bit worrying going forward in terms of...
Well, I remember some of his lines in his foreign policy speech, actually, and what he has been doing is fairly consistent with what he announced he would do. He said he would be unpredictable.
Well, that's...
And he said, but I think that's wise. And he also said that, you know, ISIS will be taken care of. He said, I don't know, I won't say where and I won't say how. I remember that line particularly well as it happens. So that's more or less what he's doing. Yeah. That's more or less what he's doing. And he's sending a signal which extends beyond foreign policy to the way he'll deal with other countries generally. And even in terms of domestic politics, he's projecting a strength that has been quite absent.
I take your point, but Lenny, I've been speaking to a lot of Chinese diplomats and other diplomats, you know, over the last few months, and people may see that as a strength, but erratic behavior can also be seen as a weakness, because your allies and your adversaries cannot necessarily read what you're going to do, which leads to perhaps miscalculations, whether it's getting a healthcare bill passed in Congress or whether it's dealing with a nuclear-armed DPRK. Lenny, what's your thoughts?
And again, so much of this is in the eye of the beholder. You can say he's unpredictable, and that's a strength. But you know, one person's unpredictability is somebody else's being rash and erratic, as you say, and reactive. And you know, so the critics will say, well, he's all of a sudden saying he didn't realize how complex these things were. He didn't realize how complex North Korea was. He didn't realize how complex healthcare was. And all of a sudden, he seems to be listing in the wind, not really sure where he's going. But the bottom line is that it's okay to be unpredictable with your foes. But the question is whether you want to be so unpredictable with your allies, the people that we need and depend on to be able to make things right in this world and work together. And I think that's where there's a great deal of anxiety out there in the world around the various countries and governments, you know, whether it's in Berlin or whether it's in London or elsewhere. people aren't 100% sure what he's going to do, how he's going to do it, when he's going to do it, and why he's going to do it. So I think to some extent, unpredictability isn't necessarily bad in certain circumstances, but not in all circumstances. And you can't always say it's unpredictable. Some may say it's just rash and reactive.
Mary, if you sorry, Mary.
No, I was just saying who is friend and who is foe. Even that's complicated. You saw President Trump call the head of Turkey, and now there's some to congratulate him. And now there's some criticism because of attacks on Kurds, and they said there are allies fighting ISIS, and so. Allies, friends, foreign policy has so many countries, particularly in the Middle East, intertwined. And it's so complicated that you can see you might have an action that's interpreted as strength. I mean, but what is going to be the follow-up?
Yeah. The Kurdish question befuddles people who have been studying it for 50 years anyway. So, but I also want to ask you this question. If you were a senior advisor to Donald Trump sitting in the White House, say Ivanka Trump, put yourself in Ivanka Trump's shoes. You don't have to buy them necessarily, but what would you be advising the president to do for the next 100 days?
I can't afford those shoes. I can't hardly imagine that I would be sitting at the right hand of Trump and that he would care. But if he
wanted to come out, if he wanted to get more than 40% of the vote, for example.
Well, I'd say that he would have to not just go to his supporters for these rallies where he would just bask in their support, but venture into some places where folks, he is president of the entire United States. And during the campaign, he demonized whole parts of the country. And he basically characterized inner cities as hellscapes. And he wasn't talking to everyone. So he needs to do that. And he also needs to, basically Republicans are in charge of all forms of the Congress and the White House, yet he needs to try to unify his party and also reach across the aisle to Democrats. I think people would be very surprised but also impressed because he ran on some issues a little bit as a moderate. Yep. And Democrats would actually be willing to go with him on infrastructure and some other bills. So if they saw him do that, I think that would be a signal that, okay, he realizes that this is a complicated job. He's the president of the entire country, and he has to reach out. And that also would put some of the Republicans, like in the Freedom Caucus and other areas, on notice that, listen, if I am not going to get cooperation from you, I will look at everyone because, as your guest said, I'm an unpredictable kind of guy.
Frank, do you think that's the way forward? You've mentioned this about coming together with Democrats. I mean, crossing the aisle like the old days with Tip O'Neill and Reagan, but on a grander scale. Do you think that's the way forward?
I think that is the way forward. And part of the problem right now is politics are so toxic. There's such a degree of animosity in the left with respect to Trump. And one has to wait for that to subside a little bit. I'm hoping that Ryan Care 2 fails. Trump will push it. I'm hoping that it fails. I think at that point what would make sense would be for Trump to reach out to leaders of the Democratic Party and in the Senate and say, look, this is something you've always wanted, real health care reform. Let's deal.
So almost fixing Obamacare.
Fixing Obamacare, trading for the wall. There are all sorts of things that are on the table
Sounds
right
like
now.
A deal-making thing. I mean,
Absolutely.
Trump might like that. I just want to give Lenny the last word. What would you do if you were advising the president? You got 30 seconds.
I mean, look, it always amuses me when people say the Democrats are hostile to Donald Trump and not look in the mirror and realize that they were hostile to Barack Obama for 8 years without any exclusion on that. But I would recommend to Donald Trump that he change his tone. We are not an angry country. We are a generous country. We're not a divided country. We want to be an inclusive country. And if he wants to come off as a deal maker, he can't come off as an ideologue. And I really think that's what I would advise him.
Well, our first program on the 100 days, we've got domestic policy. We'll do foreign policy next. It's a great discussion. Thanks all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for, though. Until next time, I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being with us.